Rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy.
Quite a way to start.
Yeah, right. I want you to take that list of 15 words I just read, listener, gather them up in your mind, and just, hold on to them for a little while.
Just put them right there in your working memory.
Exactly. Allow whatever associative processes you naturally use to transition them into long-term storage, and we will come back to them later in this deep dive.
Consider it a live cognitive experiment we're running together right at the top of the session.
I love doing that.
Well, it is always highly effective to start with a behavioral demonstration, especially when we are preparing to unpack a topic as mathematically and conceptually complex as human memory.
And counterintuitive, honestly.
Highly counterintuitive. Demonstrations force us to confront the limitations of our own phenomenological experience before we even look at the data.
Right. And welcome back. If you are listening to this audio overview, you are stepping into session 3 of our Foundations of Cognitive Experimental Psychology Summer Bootcamp.
We are thrilled you are continuing with the sequence.
We really are. Now, to establish our trajectory today, let's anchor back to session 2. Yesterday, we spent a significant amount of time mapping out the macro architecture of memory.
The structural models.
Yeah, the transition from short-term buffers to long-term consolidation. And we rigorously grounded ourselves in the signal detection theory framework.
We spent, an hour working through D prime?
At least an hour, yeah. Looking at how we calculate the separation of true signals from noise in a binary choice system.
So we established the structural scaffolding. We looked at the boxes and the arrows, the foundational mathematical models that cognitive psychologists historically utilized to map the system.
Right.
But structural models only tell you where things are posited to happen, not how they happen dynamically over time.
Which perfectly brings us to the mission for session 3. Today, we shift entirely from the architecture to what actually runs through that architecture. We are exploring the dynamics.
The actual moving parts.
Exactly. First, how do we get information into the system? That is encoding. Second, how do we get it back out? Retrieval.
Which sounds simple, but is incredibly fraught.
Oh, completely. We are going to deconstruct the assumption that memory is a reproductive recording device and establish the highly constructive, actively building nature of memory.
Yes.
And crucially, for our methods bridge at the end of the session, we are going to look at what happens when the assumptions of D prime just, fail us.
They do fail us. Quite spectacularly in some cases.
We will extend our signal detection framework into receiver operating characteristic analysis, or ROC analysis, which is an absolute methodological prerequisite for any incoming doctoral student.
That trajectory is critical for first-year researchers, and the most pervasive trap for incoming graduate students, and honestly, even for the lay public, is implicitly holding on to the metaphor of memory as a passive recording device.
Like the video camera metaphor.
Exactly. The video camera or the computer hard drive metaphor, where an event is written as an unalterable file and later retrieved in its original pristine form.
Right.
If there is one overarching thesis you need to internalize from chapters 5 and 6 of the Klein text and our primary sources today, it is this. Memory is a dynamic, highly active, reconstructive system.
It does not simply retrieve.
No, it rebuilds. And because it rebuilds based on probabilities and schemas, it systematically deceives us.
That's the scary part.
It is. But the distortions we are going to discuss today are not bugs or malfunctions. They are the fundamental features of how a healthy, adaptive cognitive system operates.
I want to start by attacking that hard drive metaphor directly, focusing on the very first stages, getting the information in and getting it out. Encoding and retrieval.
Let's do it.
And to do that properly, we have to look at Endel Tolving and Donald Thompson's landmark 1973 paper in Psychological Review, the one outlining the encoding specificity principle.
A truly foundational paper.
Because before Tolving, if I understand the history of the field correctly, there was a dominant assumption that memory performance was essentially just a function of trace strength.
Yes, strength theory was deeply entrenched. It was heavily influenced by the legacy of Hermann Ebbinghaus and, the early behaviorist traditions.
Just drill it in until it's strong.
Exactly. The working assumption was that a memory representation was essentially like a muscle. You exercise it through repetition or highly focused attention, and the trace gets stronger.
Makes intuitive sense.
It does. The theoretical prediction was straightforward. A strong memory trace should be universally easier to retrieve than a weak memory trace, regardless of the testing conditions.
But Tolving and Thompson fundamentally dismantle that assumption. I always found the standard analogies for this lacking, honestly.
People always compare it to searching for a file on a computer.
Right, but a computer uses literal string matching.
I think a better biological analogy, and please correct me if this mapping is flawed,
Yeah.
is the lock and key mechanism of enzymes.
Ooh, I like that.
You could have a massive concentration of an enzyme, right? A
Yeah.
very strong presence in the biological system. But if the substrate, the key, doesn't match the active site perfectly, no reaction happens.
Yeah. The strength of the enzyme is irrelevant if the structural conformation of the cue doesn't match.
That is a far superior analogy to the computer hard drive, because it captures the relational dependency between the stored representation and the triggering mechanism.
Yeah.
Tolving and Thomson established that the strength of the initial storage is only half the equation. The other, often more deterministic half, is the retrieval environment.
Right.
They formally defined the distinction between information being available versus information being accessible.
Let's break those two terms down for the listener because they sound like synonyms in everyday language, but they represent a massive theoretical divide in cognitive psychology.
Absolutely. Availability refers to whether the information is actually stored anywhere within the massive architecture of long-term memory. Does the trace exist?
Is it in the building somewhere?
Exactly. Accessibility, on the other hand, refers to whether that information can actually be retrieved right now, in this specific moment, given the current set of cues provided to the subject. Information can be perfectly available, it is in the system, but completely inaccessible if the retrieval cue fails to reinstate the specific conditions of encoding.
And the methodology they used to demonstrate this is just fascinating. They didn't just ask people to memorize lists.
No, that wouldn't have shown the effect.
They used a very specific paired associate learning task that deliberately set up a conflict between strong associations and weak associations.
Walk us through the design.
If I recall correctly, they had participants study target words paired with very weak associative cues. For example, they would see the word blea sexy paired with the word train. So train, B-L-E-sick.
Precisely. Train is a very weak cue for black. You don't naturally think of a train when you think of a color black.
Right, you think of white or dark.
Exactly. Then, during the testing phase, they gave participants strong normative cues, like the word white, and asked them to generate associates.
Like a free association task.
Yes, and then recognize if any of the words they just generated were on the study list.
And this is where the generation recognition model just falls apart. Participants would easily generate the word black in response to white.
Of course they would.
But when asked, hey, was black on the list you studied earlier? They would say no. They completely failed to recognize the target word they had just successfully generated.
It's incredible.
But, and this is the kicker, if you then gave them the weak cue from the study phase, the word train, they could effortlessly recall the word black.
That experimental maneuver completely subverted the strength theory.
Yeah.
The trace for black was obviously available. We know this because the weak cue train unlocked it perfectly.
Right.
But the strong normative cue white failed to unlock it. Why? Because the word black was not encoded in isolation.
It was tied to the train.
It was encoded in the specific context of the concept of a train. The cognitive environment at the moment of storage was inextricably linked to the target.
So it's a package deal.
It is. Tolving's encoding specificity principle states that a retrieval cue will only be effective to the extent that information from that cue overlaps with information contained in the specific memory trace.
Which naturally brings us to one of the most vivid, frequently cited studies demonstrating this principle in action. The 1975 scuba diver study by Duncan Godin and Alan Baddeley.
Published in the British Journal of Psychology.
That's the one. They took Tolving's internal cognitive context and expanded it to the external physical environment.
Literally expanded it.
Yeah, they took actual scuba divers and had them study lists of 36 unrelated spoken words. Half the divers sat on the dry land of a beach, and the other half were submerged underwater in full scuba gear, listening to the words through a communication device.
It remains a classic of experimental design because the manipulation of the independent variable is so stark.
It's dramatic.
Very. The contextual environments, dry land versus submerged underwater, share almost no physical, visual, or acoustic properties.
And the dependent variable, their recall performance, mapped perfectly onto the encoding specificity prediction. When the divers were asked to recall the words, the crossover interaction was beautiful.
Textbook perfect.
If you learned the words underwater, your recall was significantly higher if you were tested underwater compared to being tested on land.
And conversely.
Conversely, if you learned on land, you recalled best on land. The physical environment itself, the weightless feeling, the sound of the regulator, the cold water, the visual distortion, was implicitly encoded alongside the target words.
The environment acted as a massive multimodal retrieval cue.
It's context-dependent memory in its most literal form.
It is a striking demonstration. However, since we are speaking to first-year doctoral students who will be designing their own methodologies, I need to interject a severe caveat here.
Oh, please do.
Textbooks, including our own, love the Godden and Baddeley study because it is pedagogically vivid. But it frequently leaves incoming students with a wildly inflated estimation of how robust external environmental context effects actually are in typical laboratory settings.
I want to push back on that slightly, though, because phenomenologically, context-dependent memory feels incredibly powerful.
How so?
If I walk from my office to the kitchen to get something, and I completely forget what it was, the moment I walk back into my office, the memory instantly returns. The room itself feels like the trigger. Why wouldn't that translate to massive effect sizes in the lab?
Your phenomenological experience is valid, of course, but we have to look at the aggregate data. I direct your attention to a massive 2001 meta-analysis by Stephen Smith and Edward Vila.
Okay.
They aggregated decades of research attempting to replicate and extend these physical environmental context effects. What they found is that while the effect is statistically reliable, the effect sizes are generally small to medium at best.
Really? Just small to medium?
Yes. But more importantly, the effect is highly contingent on the type of retrieval task demanded of the subject.
Are you referring to the difference between free recall and recognition?
Exactly. The environmental context effect is somewhat reliable when you use a free recall paradigm.
Where the participant is just staring at a blank piece of paper.
Right, where they have to self-generate the targets, just like the divers generating the word lists. In free recall, you have zero external cues from the item itself, so you implicitly lean heavily on the environmental context to bootstrap the retrieval process.
Ah, I see. But in a recognition task, where I simply show you a word on a screen and ask, hey, did you see this word earlier? The item itself is present.
Yes, in recognition, the target item itself provides such an overwhelmingly powerful and specific retrieval cue that it essentially swamps the subtle, weak cues provided by the color of the walls in the testing room.
The word itself is doing all the heavy lifting.
Exactly. The Smith and Vela meta-analysis documents that in recognition tasks, the environmental context effect frequently vanishes entirely to zero.
That is a crucial methodological takeaway. So if a doctoral student designs an experiment where participants study stimuli in a red room and are tested in a blue room, and the dependent measure is a standard old-new recognition test.
They are likely to find absolutely no difference.
Not because encoding specificity is wrong, but because the cue of the word itself overrides the cue of the room.
Precisely. The theoretical principle of encoding specificity is universally robust, but the operationalization of that principle, manipulating the physical room, is highly fragile.
Got it.
For researchers, internal cognitive contexts, mood state-dependent effects, and the specific cognitive operations performed during encoding yield far more reliable variance than external environmental shifts.
Let's follow that exact thread then, the specific cognitive operations, because this leads us to the next major refinement in our dynamic model of memory, which is transfer-appropriate processing.
A very elegant concept.
We are looking at the 1977 paper by Morris, Bransford, and Franks in the Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior. And to understand why this paper was so disruptive, we have to look at the theory it was reacting against.
Which was Craik and Lockhart's levels of processing framework.
Right.
Levels of processing was an immensely influential framework in the early 1970s. It posited a very elegant linear model of memory strength. It argued that incoming stimuli can be processed at varying levels of depth.
Depth being the key metaphor there.
Yes. Shallow processing involves analyzing the superficial, physical, or sensory features of a stimulus like looking at a word and analyzing its font, or doing a phonological analysis of how it sounds.
Counting the syllables, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Deep processing, on the other hand, involves semantic analysis, thinking about the intrinsic meaning of the word and integrating it into your existing knowledge networks.
The core prediction being that deep semantic processing always, unconditionally, leads to vastly superior long-term memory retention compared to shallow processing.
That was the claim.
And frankly, that sounds entirely reasonable. If I spend time thinking about the definition of a word, I should remember it better than if I just counted the vowels in it.
It sounds highly reasonable, and in 95% of standard educational and laboratory settings, it holds true.
But
But Morris, Bransford, and Franks identified a hidden assumption in the levels of processing framework. The assumption was that the type of memory test used to measure retention was a neutral, transparent window.
which it isn't.
No, tests are not neutral. Standard memory tests inherently demand semantic retrieval. If you use a semantic test, of course, semantic encoding looks superior.
So they designed an experiment to test what happens when you alter the demands of the retrieval environment to match the supposedly inferior shallow processing. This is the mechanism of transfer appropriate processing.
Yes.
Walk us through their experimental manipulation because it elegantly traps the levels of processing theory.
During the incidental encoding phase, participants were given sentences with a missing word, and they had to decide if a target word fit the blank. Half the time, the sentence required deep semantic processing. For example, the blank had a silver engine. The target word is train.
So the participant has to process the meaning of train to answer yes.
Precisely. And the other half of the time, the sentence required shallow phonological processing. Blank rhymes with brain. The target is still train.
Ah, the participant doesn't need to know what a train is. They just have to analyze the acoustic sound of the word to answer yes.
Exactly. Now, under the old levels of processing framework, the semantic silver engine condition should produce far superior memory to the phonological rhymes with condition, regardless of how you test it.
Right, because deep is deep.
But Morris, Bransford, and Franks used two different tests. First, a standard recognition test. And just as predicted, the deep semantic encoding resulted in much higher hit rates than the shallow encoding.
But then comes the second test, the rhyming recognition test.
Yes. In this novel retrieval condition, they didn't ask if the participant had seen a specific word. They showed the participant a series of new words and asked, did you study a word earlier that rhymes with this new word?
Sneaky.
Very. For example, they show the word crane. The participant has to remember that they studied train earlier.
And what happens to the data?
The results completely invert. On the rhyming test, the participants who engaged in the supposedly shallow phonological encoding during the study phase performed significantly better than the participants who engaged in the deep semantic encoding.
Wow, so the entire concept of depth is relative.
Entirely relative.
Meaning isn't inherently better than sound. It's about the overlap in the cognitive algorithms. If the retrieval task requires you to search your memory using acoustic algorithms, then running acoustic algorithms during encoding creates the most accessible trace.
That is the essence of transfer-appropriate processing. The effectiveness of any encoding strategy is fundamentally constrained by the requirements of the retrieval task.
That makes total sense.
For a first-year experimentalist, the takeaway is absolute. There is no such thing as a universally optimal encoding task. You cannot design the independent variables of your study phase without explicitly mapping them onto the specific cognitive operations demanded by your dependent measures in the test phase.
All right, I want the listener to pause and synthesize what we've covered so far. We have moved from a static strength model of memory to a dynamic relational model.
A huge paradigm shift.
Memory relies on a precise matching of cues, from Tulving's internal context to external environments to the specific cognitive algorithms we run. But even this dynamic model still implicitly assumes that the trace itself, the thing being matched, is a literal verbatim record of the past.
Which is another massive misconception.
Right, it's time to shatter that assumption entirely. We need to shift into the schema tradition and ask, what does it genuinely mean for memory to be reconstructive rather than reproductive?
Well, the reproductive view assumes that memory is akin to pulling a photograph out of a drawer. It might be faded, it might be difficult to locate, but the image itself is a literal, continuous representation of the sensory input that was originally captured.
Like a Polaroid.
Yes. The reconstructive view, which is the consensus of modern cognitive psychology, argues that pulling a memory is more like being handed a scattered handful of mismatched Lego bricks and a vaguely familiar instruction manual and being tasked with building something that reasonably approximates the original object in real time.
Building it on the fly.
Every single time you remember it.
The analogy I always return to when explaining this to undergraduates, and I think it scales up perfectly for our purposes, is walking into a natural history museum and standing in front of a massive Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton.
I love this analogy.
When you look at that mount, your visual system and your semantic knowledge immediately categorize it. There is a complete dinosaur. But if you actually read the small placard at the base of the exhibit, it will inform you that perhaps only 15 to 20% of the physical material on that display consists of actual, authentic, fossilized bone excavated from the earth.
That is a highly precise analogy for the architecture of episodic memory.
The other 80% of that skeleton, the ribs, the tail section, the structural supports, is plaster, resin, and steel scaffolding. It was meticulously fabricated by the museum curator.
Filling in the gaps.
Exactly. The curator didn't just guess randomly. They used their deep, specialized knowledge of reptilian anatomy, their expectations of structural physics, and the specific context of the authentic bones they did possess to build a coherent, logical, stable shape.
And the brain is the curator.
The brain is the curator. The actual, literal, verbatim details you retain from an event, the real fossils, are remarkably sparse. The vast majority of any conscious episodic memory is plaster. It is constructed on the fly, dynamically, using your prior knowledge and expectations to fill the massive gaps between the sparse fossils.
And the researcher who pioneered this exact conceptualization decades before the cognitive revolution formally validated his models was the British psychologist Frederick Bartlett.
Right.
We are looking at his seminal 1932 monograph, Remembering.
Before we get into his methods, it is worth exploring the history of science aspect here. Why was a 1932 publication so heavily marginalized until the late 1970s and 80s?
Bartlett was a victim of the theoretical zeitgeist. In the 1930s, psychology, particularly in the United States, was overwhelmingly dominated by behaviorism.
Skinner, Watson, all of them.
Yes, behaviorists explicitly rejected the study of internal mental representations. They wanted strictly observable stimuli and observable behavioral responses.
Yeah.
Memory was reduced to habit strength and associative conditioning.
No room for museum curators in that model.
None whatsoever. Furthermore, when early cognitive models did begin to emerge in the 1950s and 60s, they leaned heavily into the computational metaphor, the brain as a serial processing computer storing distinct literal files.
And Bartlett's methodology was incredibly messy by those standards. He wasn't using carefully controlled lists of nonsense syllables like Ebbinghaus.
No, he was using qualitative methods.
Tell us about his most famous paradigm.
It involved a method of serial reproduction. He used a Native American folk tale, translated from the Chinook language, titled The War of the Ghosts. He had his participants, who are early 20th century British university students, read the text.
Okay.
Then hours, days, or even months later, he asked them to write down the story from memory as accurately as possible.
Now, The War of the Ghosts is a fascinating piece of stimulus material because its narrative structure is completely alien to a Western British reader.
Completely alien.
It contains sudden, unexplained narrative leaps. It features supernatural elements, ghosts engaged in a battle, magical canoes, warriors who are struck by arrows but feel no pain and bleed no blood. It does not follow the standard Aristotelian arc of a Western story.
And that incongruity was exactly what Bartlett was measuring. When he analyzed the participants' written recalls over time, he observed that the errors were not random instances of forgetting.
They weren't just dropping details.
No, they were actively and systematically transforming the text. Bartlett documented a process he called rationalization.
They were changing the weird parts to make them make sense.
Exactly. The supernatural canoe was frequently recalled as a simple rowboat. The bizarre, mystical elements of the battle were rationalized away as hallucinations or dreams.
Oh, wow.
If a narrative transition was missing in the original text, the participants would spontaneously invent a logical transition to connect the events. What Bartlett demonstrated is that human beings do not passively retrieve isolated facts. We actively assimilate incoming information into our pre-existing organized mental structures.
And he termed those organized mental structures schemas.
Schemas, yeah.
A schema is essentially a generalized knowledge template derived from past experience. You have a schema for going to a restaurant. If I tell you a story about going out to dinner and I say we ordered food and then left, your schema will likely fill in the detail that we paid the bill, even if I never explicitly mentioned it.
You build the placard based on the template.
Right.
Schemas are computationally necessary. We encounter far too much sensory data to encode every detail verbatim. Schemas provide a highly efficient heuristic for processing the world.
They save processing power.
They do. They allow us to predict what will happen next and selectively attend to novel information. However, the inherent cost of this computational efficiency is a massive systemic vulnerability to confirmation bias in memory. We remember a past that aligns with our templates.
To bring this out of 1932 and into the modern experimental era, let's look at how schemas drive these systematic errors in applied settings. One of the most compelling demonstrations is the Hanna study by Darley and Gross from 1983, looking at social schemas and stereotyping.
The Darley and Gross methodology is an elegant demonstration of top-down processing distorting memory retrieval.
Walk us through it.
They brought participants into the lab and had them watch a video of a fourth-grade girl, Hannah, taking a standard academic achievement test. The video is inherently ambiguous. Hannah answers some questions correctly, struggles with others, gets distracted, regains focus.
But the crucial manipulation happens before they even watch the video.
Correct. The researchers primed two different schemas. Half the participants were provided with demographic background information, suggesting Hannah came from a high socioeconomic, affluent background, wealthy neighborhood, highly educated parent.
And the other half?
The other half were given background information suggesting she came from an impoverished, lower socioeconomic background.
And then both groups watched the exact same video of the exact same girl taking the exact same test.
Yes. The sensory input is identical. But when the researchers subsequently asked the participants to evaluate Hannah's academic ability and recall her performance on the test, the results were deeply polarized.
Because of the plaster.
Exactly. The participants who encoded the video through the lens of the affluent schema recalled Hannah as performing significantly above grade level. They remembered her successes and rationalized away her mistakes as momentary fatigue.
And the participants who held the impoverished schema.
They recalled her performing significantly below grade level. They explicitly remembered her failures and dismissed her correct answers as lucky guesses.
That is wild.
The schema dictated what was encoded, what was integrated, and ultimately what plaster was used to reconstruct the memory of the video. The subjective memory of the objective evidence was entirely subsumed by the prior expectation.
This is a profound point. The participants weren't intentionally lying or expressing conscious prejudice. Their cognitive architecture genuinely reconstructed a different historical reality based on the template they applied.
It's an automatic process.
And if you think about the implications of this for eyewitness testimony or political polarization or clinical assessment, the fact that our schemas rewrite our history is staggering.
Which brings us perfectly back to the behavioral demonstration we initiated at the beginning of this deep dive. I believe we have a retrieval task to execute.
We do. Okay, listener. It has been roughly 20 minutes. I want you to reach back into your episodic memory and retrieve that list of 15 words I read to you at the very start of the show.
No cheating.
Right. Don't scrub the audio back. You don't need to recite them all, but I want you to answer a simple recognition question. Did you hear the word sleep?
Take a second.
Search the trace. Does the word sleep feel familiar? Are you reasonably confident I said it?
If you are like the vast majority of healthy, cognitively typical adults who participate in this specific paradigm under controlled laboratory conditions, you likely experience a very strong sense of recognition for the word sleep.
You might even be able to mentally generate the auditory trace of my voice articulating the word.
Which is the most amazing part.
Because here is the reveal. The word sleep was never on that list.
Never.
Bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy, no sleep. I want you to pause and critically evaluate your own cognitive state right now. Would you have predicted this result before experiencing it?
Most people would say absolutely not.
That a researcher could read you a simple list of 15 highly common words, and you would confidently, perhaps vividly, remember a word that was completely absent from the auditory input.
What you have just experienced is the Diess-Roediger-McDermott paradigm, universally referred to in the literature as the DRM paradigm. Yes. The effect was initially documented by James Diess in 1959, but like Bartlett, it was largely ignored by the field until it was resurrected and formalized in 1995 by Henry Roediger and Kathleen McDermott in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition.
A truly landmark paper.
It remains arguably the most robust, reliable, and conceptually clean demonstration of constructive false memory in the experimental toolkit.
I want to dig deeply into the mechanism here. How does the architecture actually execute this illusion so flawlessly? We know it's a schema effect broadly, but what are the specific algorithmic models that explain why my brain constructs the word sleep?
There are two dominant theoretical frameworks in the literature that attempt to model the DRM effect, and doctoral students must be fluent in both.
Okay, let's hit the first one.
The first is the activation monitoring framework, which is heavily reliant on the concept of semantic spreading activation within a network model of memory, originally pioneered by Collins and Loftus.
So mapping memory as a massive interconnected web of concepts where distance represents semantic relatedness.
Exactly. In this model, every time the host reads a word, say bed, the corresponding neural or semantic node for bed is activated. But that activation is not isolated.
It spreads out.
It automatically and rapidly spreads along associative pathways to neighboring conceptually related nodes. So bed sends a subthreshold ping of activation to the node for blanket, and crucially, to the central semantic node for sleep.
And then I read tired, and that activates its own node, but also sends another ping of spreading activation to sleep.
Yes, the DRM lists are mathematically engineered so that all 15 presented words are the strongest known associative covariates of a single unpresented critical lure, in this case, sleep.
So the network is just getting hammered from all sides.
By the time the list is finished, the central node for sleep has been indirectly bombarded with spreading activation 15 separate times. The aggregate internal activation of the sleep node actually surpasses the activation levels of some of the words that were physically presented at the end of the list.
So the memory trace for sleep is incredibly strong in terms of raw activation, but why do we fail to realize it came from inside our own head rather than from the external speaker?
That is the monitoring failure of the activation monitoring framework. During retrieval, the cognitive system looks at the massive activation level of sleep. The source monitoring system, the mechanism responsible for discriminating between internally generated thoughts and externally perceived events, evaluates this high activation and essentially makes a heuristic error.
It gets tricked by its own signal.
It concludes, this concept is so highly active, it must have been part of the external list. It mistributes the source of the activation.
That is the network explanation. What is the second theoretical framework?
The second is fuzzy trace theory, developed by Charles Brainerd and Valerie Reyna. This model posits a dual-process architecture for encoding. When you process the DRM list, you are simultaneously laying down two parallel, independent types of memory traces.
Okay, what are they?
First, you encode verbatim traces. These are highly detailed, specific, fragile representations of the exact sensory and physical properties of the items, the sound of the voice, the exact syntax. Second, you extract and encode gist traces, which represent the deep meaning, the thematic core, the semantic essence of the experience.
So the verbatim trace is the host said bed with a slight upward inflection. The gist trace is we're talking about sleep-related stuff.
Precisely. Now, the critical dynamic in fuzzy trace theory is that verbatim traces decay much more rapidly than gist traces over time.
They fade out fast.
When you're asked to retrieve the list later, the verbatim traces for the specific words may have degraded, but the gist trace sleep-related concepts is incredibly robust.
And sleep just perfectly matches the gist.
The word sleep is the absolute perfect conceptual match for the gist trace. So when the system relies on the gist to reconstruct the list, it overwhelmingly endorses the critical lore because it perfectly fits the semantic plaster.
A question that inevitably arises from incoming students: how does this map onto the neurobiology? If I put a subject into a functional MRI scanner and administer a DRM task, what does the brain do when it retrieves a true memory of the word bed versus a false memory of the word sleep? Does the brain know it's lying to itself?
Daniel Schachter and his colleagues at Harvard have conducted extensive, elegant neuroimaging research on this exact question. They used fMRI subtraction paradigms to isolate the neural correlates of true versus false recognition. And the results are fundamentally sobering.
Sobering how?
When you compare the boldiaconal, the blood-oxygen level dependent signal, during true recognition and false recognition, the most striking finding is the overwhelming neural overlap.
The same regions are firing.
Yes, there is massive equivalent activation in the medial temporal lobe network, specifically the hippocampus, which is the core engine of episodic retrieval. There is also equivalent activation in the prefrontal cortical regions responsible for effortful search and monitoring. At the macro network level, the brain is processing the false memory of sleep, using the exact same neurobiological machinery it uses to process the true memory of bed.
So from the subjective phenomenological perspective of the individual, there's literally no internal metric to distinguish the truth from the fabrication because the biological signature of the retrieval is identical.
Broadly, yes. Now, to be rigorous, Schechter's lab did isolate some incredibly subtle neural dissociations.
Okay, there is a difference.
When participants retrieve a true memory, there is occasionally a statistically significant increase in activation in the early sensory and visual cortices, the occipital lobe, or early auditory cortex.
Ah, so the brain is faintly re-experiencing the actual low-level sensory footprint of the physical word.
Exactly. The false memory, lacking that physical footprint, shows slightly less sensory activation. But these differences are highly subtle, entirely unconscious to the subject, and detectable only through complex statistical aggregation across multiple trials.
This brings us to a major, highly pervasive misconception that we must explicitly dismantle for anyone entering cognitive research. Because false memories are so striking, it is very easy to conceptualize them as a breakdown of the system.
People assume it's a flaw.
Right. People assume that succumbing to the DRM illusion is a sign of pathology, or a lack of attention, or a malfunctioning biological component.
This point cannot be overstated, and it represents a profound philosophical shift in how we view cognition. The false memory you just experienced is not a pathology. It is the normal, healthy, optimal output of a system that is functioning exactly according to its evolutionary design constraints.
Because an evolutionary environment doesn't reward verbatim recording, it rewards predictive generalization.
Yes.
If I am an early hominid walking through the savannah and I encounter a large yellow feline with sharp teeth near a specific acacia tree, I do not need a mathematically perfect verbatim representation of the exact spatial coordinates of the tree or the precise shade of yellow of the fur.
That would be a waste of resources.
What I need is the gist. Large predators in this biome are lethal. The generalization is what keeps me alive.
That is the evolutionary imperative. The cognitive architecture evolved to ruthlessly abstract the core meaning from a noisy environment to predict future threats and opportunities.
It's doing its job.
The DRM paradigm demonstrates that the exact same semantic spreading activation, the exact same gist extraction that provides us with brilliant, highly adaptive problem-solving capabilities in the real world is the specific mechanism that produces systematic, predictable distortion under the artificial constraints of the laboratory.
The plaster that fills out the dinosaur skeleton is the only reason the skeleton can stand up at all.
A beautiful way to phrase it.
Okay, so we have established that memory is highly constructive, that it abstracts gist, and that errors are an inevitable byproduct of a healthy system. But these errors are not just random static, right? They possess a distinct taxonomy.
They do.
And to organize that taxonomy, we turn to Daniel Schachter's seminal 1999 paper in American Psychologist, where he outlines the 7 sins of memory.
Schachter's framework provides an essential organizational heuristic for the field. However, again, let's preempt a conceptual error. When Schachter proposes 7 distinct sins, he is not positing the existence of 7 entirely separate neurobiological mechanisms or 7 isolated brain regions dedicated to making mistakes.
It's not a phrenology map.
No. He is offering a descriptive taxonomy, a categorization system for the different phenotypic ways our healthy reconstructive memory machinery yields functionally frustrating or inaccurate results in everyday life.
He divides the taxonomy into 2 broad categories: sins of omission, where the memory system fails to produce the desired information, and sins of commission, where the memory system successfully produces information, but the information is incorrect or actively intrusive.
Let's systematically walk through these because as a cognitive psychologist, you need to be able to map everyday cognitive failures onto these formal categories.
I'll initiate the sins of omission with the first sin: transience.
Transience is the most ubiquitous form of forgetting. It refers to the decreasing accessibility of memory over time. This is the phenomenon originally mapped by Ebbinghaus in 1885 with his forgetting curve for nonsense syllables.
And the debate within transience is whether the trace simply decays biologically over time or whether it becomes inaccessible due to interference from newly acquired overlapping information.
Precisely. The modern consensus leans heavily toward interference as the primary driver of transience in long-term memory, though decay plays a larger role in sensory and short-term buffers.
The second sin of omission is absent-mindedness. This is a conceptually distinct failure. It is not a failure of the memory trace decaying. It is a failure at the interface of attention and encoding.
Yes, absent-mindedness looks like forgetting, but it is actually a failure to ever adequately process the information into the system in the first place.
Like losing your keys.
Exactly. You arrive home, you place your car keys on a random shelf, while your internal monologue is obsessively reviewing a complex statistical model for your thesis. The next morning, you cannot locate your keys. You did not forget where you placed them. Because your attentional resources were fully allocated to the statistical model, the physical action of placing the keys was processed very shallowly, perhaps entirely automatically.
So it never made it into long-term storage.
Your working memory never allocated the resources to transition the spatial coordinates of the keys into long-term declarative storage. The trace is not lost. It was never built.
A painfully familiar reality for every doctoral student.
Indeed.
The third sin of omission is blocking. And phenomenologically, this is arguably the most intensely frustrating experience. The information is fully encoded, it is not decayed, it is highly available within the neural architecture, but it is temporarily, entirely inaccessible.
The canonical example of blocking is the tip of the tongue state. You are at a conference reception, you make eye contact with a prominent researcher whose papers you have cited extensively.
Oh, this is the worst.
You know their face, you know their theoretical orientation, you know their institutional affiliation, you know their name starts with the letter M, but the full phonological representation of the name is blocked.
And the mechanism for this often involves competitive inhibition, correct? My brain is pulling up the name McLeod, and because I am activating McLeod, I am actively laterally inhibiting the correct target name, which is McCrae.
That is the dominant model for phonological blocking. The retrieval attempt itself generates interference.
The harder I try, the more I block the target. So those are the three sins of omission transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking. Now we cross the threshold into the sins of commission, where the system is highly active, but constructing a distorted reality.
But dangerous ones.
Right. The fourth sin and the first of commission is misattribution.
Misattribution involves assigning a memory to the incorrect source, time, or person. You possess a piece of knowledge, but you lack the contextual tag of where you acquired it.
Like thinking you read something in a journal when someone just told you about it.
Yes, you confidently believe you read a methodological detail in a peer-reviewed article in cognitive psychology, when in reality, a colleague mentioned it to you casually over coffee.
If we integrate this with our earlier discussion, misattribution is the exact underlying mechanism driving the DRM paradigm.
Ah, yes. Good connection.
The node for sleep generates massive internal activation, but the source monitoring system misattributes that internal cognitive operation to an external sensory presentation.
Exactly. It is a failure of source memory, while item memory remains intact.
The fifth sin is suggestibility. This is closely related to misattribution, but involves the active incorporation of external post-event information into the memory trace of the original event. The system uses new data to overwrite or subtly alter the historical plaster.
This is the primary domain of Elizabeth Loftus and the vast literature on the misinformation effect. The classic paradigm involves participants watching a video of a complex event, like a multi-car traffic accident. Later, the researchers ask the participants questions about the event, but they subtly manipulate the linguistic framing of the question.
The famous manipulation being the verbs. How fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Versus how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other?
Yes, that single semantic substitution smashed instead of hit acts is highly potent misinformation. It suggests a higher velocity and greater violence.
And it changes what they remember.
Drastically. The dependent variable demonstrates the suggestibility. Participants exposed to the word smashed subsequently estimate significantly higher speeds, and weeks later are significantly more likely to falsely reconstruct a memory of seeing broken glass at the scene, even though no broken glass was present in the video.
The external suggestion retroactively reconstructed the memory trace.
It did.
The sixth sin is bias. This relates directly to our discussion of schemas. Bias is the retrospective distortion of the past based on your current knowledge, your current belief systems, or your current emotional state.
Our current state operates as the ultimate schema. If you are currently in a highly conflictual, unhappy romantic relationship, and a researcher asks you to recall the early formative months of your dating period, your cognitive system will implicitly bias the retrieval process.
Because you're mad right now.
Right. It will disproportionately access memories of early arguments or subtle red flags, and it will suppress memories of intense early affection. You literally construct a historical narrative that justifies and aligns with your present emotional reality.
The past is a hostage to the present.
Well said.
The seventh and final sin is persistence. And this one stands somewhat apart from the others. While the first six sins involve a failure to remember accurately, persistence is a failure to forget.
Persistence is the intrusive, repeated recurrence of memories that you actively, desperately wish to banish from consciousness. It is the cognitive engine underlying conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder or severe depressive rumination.
It's when the system won't let go.
The massive surge of emotional arousal, specifically the flooding of the amygdala and the subsequent modulation of hippocampal consolidation, creates a memory trace that is overwhelmingly pathologically accessible. The sin is that the system refuses to let the trace decay.
So to recap the taxonomy: transience, absent-mindedness, blocking, misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence.
That's the 7.
Now, we explicitly mention Elizabeth Loftus and the concept of suggestibility, and as instructors of a doctoral bootcamp, it is our responsibility to provide the necessary historical context for how these laboratory findings impacted the broader world.
We do need to touch on that.
We need to introduce a brief, highly careful note on the memory wars of the 1990s.
It is a critical inflection point in the history of psychology. The memory wars were an incredibly intense, frequently vitriolic dispute that erupted primarily between cognitive experimental psychologists, researchers embedded in the laboratory studying false memory, misinformation, and source monitoring, and a subset of clinical practitioners engaged in specific forms of trauma therapy.
The crux of the debate centered on the theoretical mechanisms and clinical reliability of recovered memories of severe childhood abuse.
Yes.
During this period, there was a significant phenomenon of adult patients entering therapy, often for generalized anxiety or depression, and over the course of the therapeutic process, which sometimes involved highly suggestive techniques like guided imagery, hypnosis, or aggressive prompting, these patients would recover incredibly vivid, traumatic memories of abuse that they had supposedly repressed and had zero conscious awareness of for decades.
The clinical practitioners utilizing these techniques argue that these were genuine, veridical memories of trauma that a biological defense mechanism had actively repressed, and that bringing them to conscious awareness was necessary for healing.
But the cognitive experimentalists disagreed.
The cognitive experimentalists, armed with the precise laboratory data we have spent the last hour discussing, the DRM paradigm, the Loftus misinformation studies, the profound power of schemas and misattribution, looked at these highly suggestive therapeutic environments with deep alarm.
The cognitive researchers presented empirical data which they argued demonstrated the fundamental malleability of autobiographical memory. They established that it is demonstrably possible, under controlled laboratory conditions, using suggestive interviewing and imagination inflation techniques, to implant entirely false, highly emotional autobiographical memories into the minds of healthy adults.
To be explicitly clear to our listener, as experimental psychologists, we do not take a definitive stance on the ultimate historical truth of any specific, individualized clinical case of trauma.
Of course not.
Human clinical reality is fraught, complex, and deeply nuanced, and genuine trauma does occur and can be difficult to retrieve.
However, what you must internalize as an incoming doctoral student is that the highly technical, abstract concepts we are studying, semantic spreading activation, source monitoring errors, the reconstructive nature of retrieval, these are not confined to the sterile vacuum of a laboratory.
No, they leak out into the real world.
The science of cognitive psychology collided directly, forcefully with the criminal justice system and clinical psychiatry. The laboratory data regarding how memory is constructed fundamentally altered the legal landscape regarding the reliability of eyewitness testimony and shifted the ethical boundaries of acceptable clinical therapeutic practice.
It is a sobering, necessary reminder that the structural mechanics of how we encode and retrieve information carry profound, life-altering consequences for human beings.
Okay. We have mapped the dynamics. We have explored encoding, reconstruction, false memory, and the 7 sins. It is now time to execute our methods bridge.
The final piece of the puzzle.
In session 2, we built the architecture of signal detection theory and learned to calculate D prime as a measure of sensitivity. Today, we are bridging from standard D prime into ROC analysis. But you cannot understand a methodology without understanding the theoretical problem it was designed to solve.
You need the context.
So we first have to set up the live theoretical debate that makes RAC analysis an absolute necessity.
Yes. We are shifting focus strictly to the domain of recognition memory. When you are presented with a stimulus, say, you see the barista at your local coffee shop while you are walking through the grocery store, and you successfully recognize them, how does your cognitive architecture accomplish that judgment?
Is recognition driven by a single unitary process, or is it driven by 2 fundamentally distinct cognitive processes?
Now, I want to clarify a massive misconception right at the outset. Because dual process theory is so conceptually intuitive, A lot of undergraduate textbooks present it as established, settled science. They teach that there are definitively two processes.
But that is not true, is it? This is a highly active, fiercely contested debate in the current literature.
It is arguably one of the most prominent ongoing theoretical battles in memory research. On one side, we have the dual process tradition. Historically, this traces back to George Mandler and Larry Jacobi, but for our purposes, we are focusing on the mathematical formalization by Andy Ioannidis, specifically his seminal 2002 review in the Journal of Memory and Language.
Okay, dual process.
The dual process model argues that recognition is the output of two independent systems operating in parallel: familiarity and recollection.
Let's define those precisely.
Familiarity is conceptualized as a fast, automatic, continuous variable. It acts very much like a standard signal detection process. It provides a generic feeling of knowing without any contextual details.
You see the person in the grocery store and the familiarity signal spikes. You know you have encountered them before, but you have no idea who they are or where you met them.
Exactly. Recollection, conversely, is conceptualized as a slower, effortful, threshold-based process. It involves the conscious, specific retrieval of the qualitative details of the prior encounter.
So after a few seconds, the recollection process kicks in and you retrieve the specific episodic context.
Ah, that is the barista who accidentally spilled oat milk on the counter yesterday.
So two distinct biological and cognitive mechanisms working together to produce a recognition judgment.
And what is the opposing framework? The opposing framework is the single process account, championed most rigorously by John Wickstead, specifically culminating in his 2007 paper in Psychological Review. Wickstead argues that positing two entirely separate systems is parsimoniously unnecessary.
Occam's razor.
Exactly. He argues that recognition is driven by a single, continuous variable, which we can broadly term memory strength.
So how does a single process account for the phenomenological difference between vague familiarity and vivid recollection? Because they feel incredibly different internally.
Wickstead argues that familiarity and recollection are not different mechanisms. They are simply different phenomenological labels we attach to different regions along the exact same continuum of strength.
So it's just a matter of intensity.
A very weak memory trace generates a low signal, which subjectively feels like vague familiarity. A highly robust, deeply encoded memory trace generates a massive signal, which subjectively feels like vivid recollection. It is a difference of degree, not a difference in kind.
If I am a doctoral student looking at this debate, my first instinct is to go back to the toolkit we learned in session 2. We spent hours learning D prime, which is explicitly designed to measure the strength of a signal against noise. Why can't we just design a massive recognition experiment, calculate the D prime values, and definitively mathematically adjudicate whether it is one process or two?
It seems like the obvious solution.
Why does D prime fail us here?
This is the crux of the methods bridge. The standard D prime framework rests on a foundational mathematical premise known as the equal variance assumption.
Okay, equal variance.
When we draw our signal detection distributions, the noise distribution for new items on the left and the signal distribution for old items on the right, D prime, assumes that those two bell curves possess the exact same shape, the exact same standard deviation, and the exact same variance.
So they look identical, just shifted.
It assumes the only difference between them is that the signal distribution is shifted to the right along the x-axis.
If I'm mapping this onto what we covered yesterday, it sounds like standard D prime assumes that adding a memory trace to an item adds a uniform, identical constant of strength to every single item.
Yes.
But based on our entire discussion today about the dynamics of encoding attention, schemas, semantic overlap, that has to be biologically impossible. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Your interpretation is flawless. The equal variance assumption is catastrophically violated in almost all human recognition memory tasks.
Because we don't encode everything equally.
Yeah, exactly. When a participant studies a list of 100 words, they do not encode them uniformly. Some words capture their full attention, some words are deeply integrated into semantic schemas, while other words are processed shallowly while the participant is briefly distracted.
So the addition of memory strength is highly variable.
Highly. The distribution of the noise, the new items, remains relatively tight and coherent because none of them have been studied. But the distribution of the signal, the old items, becomes highly dispersed.
It flattens out.
It flattens out and spreads widely to the right because of the massive variability in encoding quality. The signal distribution has a significantly larger variance than the noise distribution.
And D prime can't handle that.
Because the core mathematical formula for standard D prime relies on dividing the distance between the means by a shared standard deviation. Utilizing d prime when variances are unequal produces highly distorted, mathematically invalid estimates of true memory sensitivity.
Okay, the tool is broken for this specific job. So what is the superior tool?
We must construct the ROC curve.
Right.
ROC stands for Receiver Operating Characteristic. It is a mathematical technique originally developed during World War II for radar operators to distinguish enemy bombers from flocks of birds, but it has become the absolute gold standard for modeling human recognition memory.
We are going to spend the remainder of our time systematically walking through how to build and interpret this curve because you will use it repeatedly in your career.
To construct an ROC curve, we have to alter our experimental design. In a standard D-prime task, the participant only provides a binary response, old or new.
Which just gives you one hit rate and one false alarm rate.
Exactly. That gives us one single dot on a graph. You cannot draw a curve with one dot.
So we need more data points from the same participant. How do we extract them without running 6 different experiments?
We shift from binary responses to confidence ratings. During the recognition test, when the participant sees a word, we do not just ask old or new. We require them to rate their confidence on a multi-point scale, typically a 6-point scale.
Let's define the scale for the listener just so we can visualize it. A rating of 6 means I am absolutely 100% certain I studied this word.
Right.
A 5 is I am pretty sure it is old. A 4 is I am guessing it is old. A 3 is I am guessing it is new. A 2 is I am pretty sure it is new. And a 1 is I am absolutely 100% certain this word is new.
We run the participant through hundreds of trials and collect this granular confidence data. Now, to plot the ROC curve, we establish a two-dimensional graph space.
I will visually map the space for you, listener. Picture a standard Cartesian graph.
The x-axis.
The x-axis running horizontally along the bottom is the false alarm rate. This is the proportion of new, unstudied items that the participant incorrectly claims are old. It scales from 0.0 on the far left to 1.0 on the far right.
And the axis.
The axis running vertically is the tit rate. This is the proportion of old, studied items that the participant correctly identifies as old. It also scales from 0.0 at the origin to 1.0 at the peak.
Excellent. Now, to generate our multiple data points within this space, we apply a sliding mathematical criterion to the confidence data we collected.
A sliding criterion.
We calculate hit and false alarm rates iteratively, becoming progressively more lenient with what we define as an old response.
Walk me through the exact calculation for the first data point. Let's make this concrete.
For point 1, we set the most conservative, strict criterion possible. We instruct the algorithm, only count a trial as an old response if the participant used the highest confidence rating, a 6. We ignore everything else. We look at all the actually old items and calculate what percentage received a 6. That is our hit rate. We look at all the actually new items and calculate what percentage mistakenly received a 6. That is our false alarm rate.
Because we are being so incredibly strict, both numbers will be low.
Yes. The hit rate might be 0.40 and the false alarm rate might be incredibly small, say 0.05. We plot that coordinate. It sits in the lower left quadrant of the graph space.
Okay, now we need point 2. We slide the criterion.
We relax the threshold slightly. We now instruct the algorithm, count a trial as an old response if the participant said 6 OR if they said 5.
So we expand the net.
We aggregate the 6s and 5s. We recalculate the proportions. Because we're being more lenient, the hit rate inherently increases, but inevitably the false alarm rate also increases.
We plot that new coordinate, which moves up and to the right from the first point.
And we simply iterate this process. Point 3 defines old as a 6, 5, or 4. Point 4 includes the 3s, point 5 includes the 2s.
With every step, we become more lenient, accumulating more hits, but absorbing more false alarms until we have plotted 5 distinct points traversing across the graph.
Now we connect those points with a line. The resulting geometric shape is the ROC curve.
And what does it look like?
Typically, it originates near the bottom left corner, arcs steeply upward toward the top left, and then gradually bows outward, curving toward the top right corner.
Let's discuss how to interpret the shape of this space. If a participant has absolutely zero memory, if they were asleep during the study phase and are just pressing buttons randomly, what does their curve look like?
If they're guessing randomly, their hit rate will constantly equal their false alarm rate at every single criterion. Point 1 will be 0.1, 0.1, point 2 will be 0.3, 0.3.
It's just a 1-to-1 ratio.
When you connect the dots, it forms a perfectly straight diagonal line cutting exactly through the center of the graph, from the bottom left origin to the top right corner. The diagonal represents pure chance performance.
And what if the participant has literal photographic infallible memory?
They would perfectly separate the signal from the noise, even at the strictest criterion. The curve would shoot vertically up the axis to a hit rate of 1.0 with zero false alarms, anchor in the absolute top left corner, and then run horizontally across the top.
The top left corner is the promised land, perfect discrimination.
Exactly. Real human data always bows somewhere in the vast space between the chance diagonal and the perfect top left corner. And the standard metric we use to quantify how far it bows is the area under the curve, or AUC.
AUC.
Yes. AUC is calculated by mathematically integrated the geometric area beneath the plotted ROC curve. It provides a single, non-parametric metric of memory sensitivity that does not rely on the flawed equal variance assumption of D prime.
So what's a good score?
The chance diagonal yields an AUC of exactly 0.50. Perfect performance is an AUC of 1.0. In typical laboratory recognition experiments with healthy adults, a robust ROC curve yields an AUC hovering around 0.80.
Okay, we have constructed the curve, we understand the space. Now let's tie the math back to the theory. This is the crucial bridge.
The whole reason we did this.
How does spending all this effort to draw a curve allow us to adjudicate the massive theoretical debate between Jan Linus's dual process model and Wiksted's single process model?
This is where the synthesis of mathematical modeling and cognitive theory becomes incredibly elegant. These two theoretical models make fundamentally different mathematical predictions regarding the precise geometrical shape of the ROC curve.
Explain the Jan Linus dual process prediction first.
The Jan model posits that recollection is a threshold process. It either happens or it doesn't. When recollection occurs, it yields high confidence, hits with virtually zero false alarms.
Right.
Mathematically, adding a threshold recollection process to a continuous familiarity process pushes the left-hand side of the ROC curve sharply upward along the y-axis. It distorts the bow. Therefore, the dual process model formally predicts an asymmetrical ROC curve.
So it's not a perfect smooth arc. It's warped by the recollection system, hijacking the high confidence responses. And what does Wiksted's single process model predict?
Wiksted utilizes an unequal variance signal detection model. By formally modeling a single continuous process, but mathematically accounting for the fact that the signal distribution has a much larger variance than the noise distribution, his model predicts a much smoother, sweeping, symmetrical ROC curve in probability space.
So the adjudication process is empirical. We run the experiments, we plot the empirical dots from thousands of human participants, and we utilize complex maximum likelihood estimation to see whether the asymmetrical dual process mathematical equation or the symmetrical single process mathematical equation provides a statistically superior fit to the actual human data.
Exactly. We let the geometry of the data determine the validity of the cognitive architecture.
And who wins? Which model fits the data better?
That is the beautiful, frustrating realities of science at the edge of human knowledge. The debate is unresolved.
Still, the empirical data is fiercely nuanced. Under certain specific experimental manipulations, like forcing subjects to respond very rapidly, the data leans toward the dual process fit. Under other standard conditions, the unequal variance single process model provides a mathematically superior fit with fewer free parameters.
So they're still fighting it out.
The debate is highly active in the journals right now, but the essential point for the first-year doctoral student is this. ROC analysis is the arena in which this battle is fought. You cannot participate in modern memory theory. You cannot publish in high-impact cognitive journals without fundamentally understanding the shape and implications of this curve.
Let's distill this into practical methodology. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the 3 concrete, actionable takeaways for student researchers regarding ROC analysis?
First, when you are designing any task utilizing recognition memory, you must be deeply fundamentally skeptical of using simple D prime. The equal variance assumption will likely fail you, and it will distort your effect sizes.
Number 2. Second, always program your experimental software to collect confidence ratings. Asking for a 6-point scale instead of a binary response costs you almost 0 additional experimental time, but it preserves the variance required to build an ROC curve during analysis.
It's free data.
Basically. And third, utilize the area under the curve, the AUC, as your primary default summary measure of memory sensitivity. It is a mathematically honest, non-parametric metric that respects the true dispersion of human memory.
Brilliant. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of theoretical, historical, and methodological terrain today. Let's do a highly focused structural recap.
We dismantle the static strength theory of memory by exploring Tulving and Thomson's encoding specificity, establishing that accessibility relies on the precise relational matching of cues.
We documented the fragility of physical context effects with the scuba diver study and expanded relational matching to cognitive algorithms through transfer-appropriate processing, demonstrating that depth of processing is entirely relative to the retrieval task.
We initiated the schema tradition with Bartlett's reconstructive view, demonstrating how our cognitive architecture aggressively assimilates incongruent information to build coherent, albeit distorted, historical narratives.
We confronted the DRM paradigm, establishing that our healthy, highly adaptive machinery systematically extracts gist, which inevitably generates robust, false memories that are neurobiologically indistinguishable from true memories at the macro level.
We organized the inevitable phenotypic failures of this system using Schachter's taxonomy of the seven sins: transience, absent-mindedness, blocking, misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence, and carefully noted how these laboratory realities intersected with clinical practice during the memory wars.
And finally, we modeled productive scientific disagreement by mapping the recollection familiarity debate. And we rigorously walked through the mathematical construction of the ROC curve, establishing why we must abandon the equal variance assumptions of D prime when evaluating recognition.
Looking ahead to Session 4 of the Bootcamp, we are going to transition our theoretical focus from memory to attention. But the conceptual framework we built today, the understanding of a highly dynamic, actively predictive, resource-constrained cognitive system, will echo throughout the remainder of the course.
That's foundational.
And for Session 4, our next methodological bridge will move away from accuracy metrics and focus deeply on reaction time modeling.
The mind is not a passive receptor. It is an active builder. And as always, a closing reminder for our doctoral cohort. This audio overview is a session companion designed to provoke thought, synthesize the massive macro concepts, and clarify the methodologies. It is absolutely not a replacement for actually reading the primary sources and the assigned textbook chapters, Klein 5 and 6, before we see you in the seminar room tomorrow morning.
The foundational learning, the true structural integration of these concepts, only happens through the deep, focused reading of the literature.
So, as you go about the rest of your day, try to catch your own cognitive machinery in the act. Pay attention to the schemas guiding your social interactions. Notice the phenomenological frustration when you experience a tip of the tongue blocking state.
See it working in real time.
And think back one last time to that list of words I read you at the very beginning. Bed, rest, awake, tired. Even now, having spent an hour deconstructing the cognitive architecture, knowing exactly the spreading activation algorithms involved, knowing precisely how the neurobiological trick is done, does the word sleep still feel just a little bit like a memory?